So now we'll be looking at loads of different types of renewable resources, specifically starting off with wind and solar power. So, what we're going to look at is look at wind and solar power and also look at their pros and cons. But first, how does wind power generate electricity? So, let's have a look at this example. We've already looked at the whole energy transfers that happen between them. So here we've got strong winds which turn the turbines, which then turn the generator, which are then converted into electrical energy. Okay, so this is the process of generating electricity through wind power. Now, the next thing we can look at is solar cells. So, solar power is generated through solar cells, which gain energy from the sun. Two important uses include low energy devices, so like watches and calculators, they use solar power, and also remote regions, so desert areas, um, desert areas or um, very remote areas like in Australia, they tend to use solar power. Just a little fun fact is like if you just cover a fraction of the Sahara Desert with a solar farm, then you can meet the entire global energy demand. Um, so now they're being used on much larger scales to generate electricity for entire towns. And the world's largest solar plant, sorry, can power over 1 million homes, located in India and China. So let's look at the pros and cons of wind and solar power. Firstly, some of the pros is got low running costs. So the cost of actually running on wind and solar power, that is very low. Also, you don't produce things like pollutants like carbon dioxide, so they don't contribute to global warming. However, there are high upfront costs. So although the running costs are low to actually build the solar plant or to build the windmill, put it up, it's quite expensive. Um, and the building of it could produce pollution. Also, a really key con is that they're dependent on the weather. So their reliability is all to do with the weather. Also, there's no way that we can increase supply in times of peak demand. It takes up a lot of space. It doesn't look nice and it's too noisy. Some of the pros are they don't damage the environment through pollutants, and it's getting cheaper every year because solar technology, wind technology, improving installation costs are dropping as we are technologically improving. So that's all on wind and solar power. So now let's look at geothermal power. Let's look at how it works, and also let's look at the pros and cons of geothermal power. Okay, so geothermal energy is the thermal energy stored in the Earth's crust. And this heat energy originated from the initial formation of our planet and from the ongoing radioactive decay of materials like uranium that are deep inside the Earth. It's the same type of energy that heats hot springs across the world. So this is a picture, and there's many hot springs. One of the ones that I personally visited was in Pamukkale in Turkey. Now, we can use geothermal energy either directly for heat or to generate electricity. Okay, heating is a cheaper of the two because it involves pumping water down and up back to the surface to heat our homes. So that's an example of how we use it directly for heat. Now, in contrast, we would, in order to generate electricity, we instead would leave the water underground until it heats up so much that it's converted to steam and that turns a turbine. Okay, similar to the whole process for wind. The turbine then generates electricity. So let's look at the pros and cons. So firstly, they can only, that one of the big disadvantages is that they can only be used in very specific regions, like volcanic regions. The power plants for them can be very expensive to build. However, even though the power plant can cause a bit of damage, so the drilling can cause a bit of damage, it's very slight damage in comparison to fossil fuels. And also, they don't produce carbon dioxide like pollutants. It's renewable and it's very reliable. So, unlike wind and solar, it is very reliable. Okay, so that's on geothermal power. Okay, so let's now have a look at hydroelectric dams and tidal barrages. So this is an example of, or this is an image of a hydroelectric dam. It's made up of a higher water level on one side, a reservoir, whereas a tidal barrage has trapped water as the tide comes in. And again, it's higher level. It's a higher level of water on one side, and then there's an estuary where the river meets the ocean. Okay. So tidal power use tides, which is the rise and fall of sea level due to the moon's gravity. Okay. The only difference between the two is what causes the difference in water levels. So in a normal hydroelectric dam, we trap water, and in a in a hydroelectric dam, we're just trapping water that prevents it from going upstream, which goes again to the ocean. Um, and we call this a reservoir. So it basically looks like a big lake. And then for tidal barrages, we're making use of tides, which is the cyclic rise and fall of sea levels due to the moon's gravity. So twice a day we get a high tide, which is where the level of water in the ocean rises, and this also happens in estuaries. So like we said, an estuary is where's the river where the river meets the ocean. Okay, so in both cases, it's the difference in water levels that we're using to generate electricity. The difference in heights also means that so there's a difference in water level and there's also differences in heights. So sorry, I should have labeled the differences in heights. So it's the gravitational potential energy that comes, and that is then converted into kinetic energy, which turns a turbine and then generates electricity. So it's all they're all very similar, all the different types of renewable energy. But here it's going to be the high water level which is causing it. Sorry. Okay, now let's have a look at hydroelectric dams and tidal barrages and the pros and cons. So firstly, large amounts of energy with very little pollution. So large amounts of energy are produced with no pollution. They're reliable sources of energy. There's low running cost and they work on large and small scales as well. So you can choose. However, they have a big impact on the environment. They can negatively affect habitats. They can also stop boats and fish from traveling. And the initial setup cost is often very expensive. Okay. Just for hydroelectric dams, there's immediate response to increased demand because you can release water whenever you feel like you need more. There's a whole a huge risk to habitats and villages because you're stopping this whole load of water as well. Okay, so that's hydroelectric and tidal. Next, we will look at biofuels. Okay, so biofuels. So a biofuel is a fuel made from a recently living organism. Okay. Now this is a little bit different to some of the other ones, but it does at the same time work in a similar way. The fact that they were recently living is the most important thing here because fossil fuels are also made from living organisms, but this was millions of years ago. So biofuels are recently living, and that's what makes them renewable. They generally come from plants and algae through photosynthesis, but they can also come from animal waste on a smaller scale. Okay. Plants and algae can photosynthesize, which can then be released later when we burn them for fuels. Okay. We can also use animal waste, but this is often on a much smaller scale. And although we burn biofuels, and they do release carbon dioxide, we say that they're carbon neutral because they can be taken whilst regrowing those plants. Okay, so this is one that does release carbon dioxide, but we say, okay, they are carbon neutral. So, firstly, some of the benefits are that they are renewable. They're relatively cheap also to make. They're quite easy to transport and they can mix with fossil fuels, so petrol. Um, so um, they can basically you don't need to get new cars um, to use them. However, they need a lot of land to grow. So we need somewhere to grow all of these, and generally that means you need to use natural land, which could involve like cutting down trees, which could also release carbon dioxide. Um, and also, some of the issues is that transporting requires energy, harvesting, processing. So it's the question of are they really carbon neutral? Okay, so we'll stop there. That's all the renewable energy topic.